I've also had the opportunity to write a number of books over these years. I didn't start out trying to be an author. Because I'm an extreme extrovert, I really never pictured myself simply sitting in my study and writing all day long. And they kind of came one by one. Actually, education ministry in the congregation I mentioned earlier, when people said, in order to stay here at seminary, get known in the church, do your PhD, and write a book. So I did. It was my beginning of writing about education. After Britton and I had been writing the Since You Ask column for just a year, it was suggested that he and I do the book Since You Ask, answering the questions but also having further dialogue, because often we would, after we wrote and published our responses to their questions, other people wrote back and disagreed with us. So this book really pursues that. Now, if we had done that over 13 years, that would have been quite a volume. In 1994, my dear colleague Ralph Smith was killed in an automobile accident over the Thanksgiving Day weekend. And he and I had been teaching together and actually been thinking about writing a book together on our course. But the whole community at Wartburg grieved so much that it just became clear to me the day of his funeral that I needed to draw together his homilies and also some of his hymns that he had been writing. And so writing Gentle Strength, Homilies and Hymns of Ralph Smith, was really a work of a grief work that we had finished by the time the seniors graduated that next spring. About that same time, Nelvin Voss and I had been working for a number of years together on a number of commissions for the church, and had worked on a resource for adult education of helping people connect their faith in daily life. And in fact, it was just at the time I was writing the other book that we had the possibility of writing Where in the World Are You? Connecting Faith and Daily Life for Alban. So that was an invitation to new life and new potential, and again a partnership, a familiar partnership of working with Nelvin. This book we continue to use not only in classes but in workshops, really all denominations all over the country. Then we redid the adult resource, Connections, Faith and Life. It was exciting. Again, it was on an airplane that I thought of the idea of using Luther's large catechism with adults. It has also Psalms and John and Romans to carry through, but it's basically a theological piece so that people could think about theology in their own languages. Included in this were visits to people on their places of vocation. And that assignment I continue with students today. We would do theology not in the church basement or fellowship hall, but in the place where people lived and worked. This it turned out to be a life-changing resource for adults. And even though it's out of print, things go in and out of print very quickly today, I hope it will continue to be used by people. It had been some time since I'd written a book in my basic field of educational ministry. So I started writing magnum opus, maybe that's not it, everything I knew about educational ministry after I'd been teaching for 15, 20 years. As it turned out, I wrote this for Religious Education Press, and that was a very scholarly press, and I wrote and then did lots of research and followed along biblical, and when I had it all done, I received a letter in the mail that Religious Education Press is going out of business. I had a contract, but that didn't mean anything. Now, I could have just laid down on the floor and cried, but instead I put in a phone call to Abingdon Press and said, would you like a book on educational ministry? And lo and behold, working with Robert Radcliffe, they did. And so this book, The Church's Learning Community, A Comprehensive Guide to Christian Education, actually is being used in seminaries and congregations and colleges all over the world. Norway, Sweden find it a very helpful book in their context. Canada, Australia, and some graduate schools as well as congregations. So this has turned out to be a real blessing. And publishing with Abingdon was probably a blessing in disguise, because it was a much broader number of people that we would reach. Well, I knew about Abingdon because I had visited with Robert Radcliffe at a professional meeting the year before, and looking at their book display, I noticed that there really wasn't anything written by women about ministry. There's a lot of books about the phenomena of women's being ordained, but where was the book that showed women, let women tell their own stories about how they were doing ministry? Do women do ministry differently? I wanted to ask that question. And so I asked a number of women who had been authors for The Persistent Voice and said, would you write a story? Tell me how you do ministry. Again, it was a matter of letting their voices come forth. I didn't start out by saying, now this is this topic, you write on this, you write on this, you write on this, but rather, tell me about your ministry. And then after we had all their stories, the fun part was putting it together in 3 parts: trusting God, liberating Christians, well, 4 parts: living vocation, and nurturing community. There are a couple of lay people, 1 diaconal minister in here, but it's a wonderful book, and it's been fun because I hear that it's been used at some seminaries in general courses for women and men, and some don't even notice that all the authors are women. We've come a long way. Not long after that, well, it kind of follows the same theme of gathering people's voices. I have been editor for Currents in Theology and Mission for a number of years, the Wartburg Seminary editor of this journal that's put out by Lutheran School of Theology in Chicago. And so we had various authors in those journal issues, but I thought, why don't we do a book together as our faculty? A colleague of mine in New York City said, what, are you crazy, Norma, trying to get all of your professors in one book? But it wasn't crazy at all, because we had a wonderful collegiality and a collaborative spirit at Wartburg. However, it was a task. Editing books is probably harder than writing them. I was determined that there would be the voice of every professor in that book, not just some and others not, but that all would have a voice and all would have chapters about the same length. As we started out together, instead of talking for 5 years and trying to come to agreement on a certain topic, which we probably wouldn't have, we said, let's see the different voices that we have and how we might not try to blend them into some one voice, but even push those differences further. And then it was fun for me to put some chapters side by side that might have quite different voices. We came up with the title, The Difficult but Indispensable Church. And the variety of voices in the same book is not unlike the varieties of voices and vocations in the same church or the same congregation. And again, the theme of how do we live together as body of Christ, many members, one body. It was a good work to do, and I loved it. Only later did I find out that this cover, which is a beautiful cover, probably one of the favorite of my books, is really of washerwomen, and I just loved it. Later, Steve Meising and I wrote a study guide that this might help use that book. Well, I wondered about writing a book then on leadership, and contacted Alban, from whom I had written earlier, and also Abingdon. And again, the editor at Abingdon said, you got a chapter in here on conflict. Why don't you begin with that? Because everyone needs some help with conflict. I researched the numbers of books out there on conflict, most of them written by men, and most of them with the theme of kind of holding your turf against others, or on pitting change against conflict, or change against apathy. And I thought, no, they don't have to be over against one another. And so I wrote the book, From Contention to Collaboration. How do we collaborate on conflict? Images of conflict, because we all have different images in our head, whether it's a mess or a fight or abusive, or whether it's a game or whether it's fun. Patterns of conflict. How do they grow and wane, and when does conflict become contagious? Our own personal histories with conflict. The various roles we can play. Sometimes we're the subject, sometimes we're a participant, sometimes we can be mediator. People sometimes say, well, choose your battles. that's only one image of conflict, isn't it? But rather I say, choose your role. What role clarity do you need to find so that you can play the important role that you can in this conflict? And then 7 responses, whether it's avoidance, confrontation, competition, control, accommodation, compromise, or collaboration itself. At that same time, however, my son Joel says, "Mom, you don't have to write 2 books at the same time." But somehow the opportunities would just kind of come together. And so actually 3 times that happened. At the same time, the opportunity came about to write Open the Doors and See All the People, Stories of Church Identity and Vocation. Now, I know you shouldn't have a favorite book, like you shouldn't have a favorite child, and I don't. However, if I had to pick, it'd be this little book that in 100 pages, it could have been 1,000 pages. I tell the stories of my visits to congregations. Over the past, dozen years, I've probably visited about 150 congregations around this country. And each one has a story. It's not a matter of saying, now, in order for you to succeed, you've got to be like that church down the road. But rather starting out, again, inductively. What is the identity? What's the history? What are the joys and strengths and challenges of this congregation in this place? It's a storybook, actually. And as people read the stories and think about those congregations, maybe they can begin to think about their own. The first story begins, turn off the interstate ramp and go left onto 29th Street. Go east 2 miles. You'll drive by the church, so turn around and come back. As I wondered aloud about directions that assumed I would miss my destination, the pastor added, we sit back a little. It was fun. And yes, 2 more at the same time. Over the years, the professors of educational ministry at our 8 seminaries in the ELCA and the 2 in Canada have written 5 or 6 books together, and recently we've done a couple of videos together as well. Lifelong Learning, Education for Christian Living, the Ministry of Children's Education, Confirmation, and it was a wonderful partnership for professors from these various seminaries to write together. The most recent one I was privileged to edit, Christian Education as Evangelism, and so often these 2 topics are pitted against each other. Either we're nurturing people or we're reaching out. Well, learning leads to mission, leads to learning, leads to mission. Education leads to evangelism, leads to... If they don't, then both are cold and stone-like. But when they do, there's new life. And so again, this was a joy. And working with those colleagues over the years has been a special blessing. And then Craig Nesson and I, who have been teaching church administration now for over 13 years, wrote the book together that really is based on that course, which is kind of a culmination of the second area of my teaching, which is leadership and church administration, transforming leadership, new vision for a church in mission. And it's been a joy to now use this in the classroom. Once you have the books, then you can go further with students in discussion. And so this has been a great joy to both write with him, but also to produce for not only our own students here, but for the broader church and world.